Hello, everybody. I'm John Atack yet again, and I am pleased for the first time to welcome Pamela Nickel Williams. Hi, Pamela.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for including my full name. That's my pen name.
Okay.
So I appreciate that. Nickel is my maiden name, and that was my parents' name,
Uh-huh.
and they were Scientologists.
And so that you were born in the 1950s, as was Sting, of course, and several other of us. And where were you born?
So I was born in 1958, and I was
Mhm.
born in Washington, D.C., and my parents were working side by side with Ron Hubbard at the founding Church of Scientology in D.C. And they were there from 1957. They stayed through 59, even though L. Ron Hubbard had already left and gone over to the UK
Mm.
and started his practices over in St. Hill.
Yeah.
But they were there for about 3 years, and I was born right after Arthur Hubbard. So my mother and Mary Sue Hubbard were pregnant together.
Okay. And how did your parents get involved with Scientology?
A good question. Mostly because of my father.
Mm.
So my father, he was an avid science fiction fan, and he used to read Astounding Science Fiction, which was one of the magazines that L. Ron Hubbard wrote for, when he wrote science fiction. And I think they call them pulp magazines.
They
I think
did
that's the,
indeed.
the,
Yeah.
the term for them, right?
Penny a
So
word.
and right. So he was already aware of Hubbard's writing. And when Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, came out, he read that and he was pretty much hooked from the beginning.
Mm.
It spoke to him, and he started practicing Dianetics at the Wichita Dianetics Foundation
Yeah.
because he lived in Kansas. He lived in near Wichita. And so that's where he got his start. And then when you know the history better than I do, but when all of that fell apart and Hubbard suffered financial issues, that's when he, moved and eventually ended up in DC
Mm.
and opened up the founding Church of Scientology. And my parents got married in 55. And then by 57, they had moved to DC and they worked with him and worked for him.
Mm. And what are your earliest memories around the subject as a child?
That's a really great question. So they were part of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists. So they used to call it HAS, and then it became international, later
As it were.
on. Right, right. So my earliest memories are really as probably about 4 years old.
Mm.
So in writing about, my story, I've had to fill in some of the gaps, definitely, from what I could remember as a child. But I always remember the vocabulary of
Mm.
Scientology, being spoken in my home. My parents told stories about, being in DC and being with Hubbard. As we moved around the country, my father was a technical writer and he worked for aerospace companies.
Right.
And so we moved a bit because of that. But we didn't get out to Los Angeles for my parents to really start practicing Scientology wholeheartedly until the 60s.
Mm.
Although my mother was at St. Hill, my father didn't go, but my mother and myself and my little brother were at St. Hill in 1967.
Okay. So, um, so what, about 10 years old, something like that?
I was 9,
9.
when we went to St. Hill, and we flew on a double-decker bus. They don't, I mean bus, airplane. They
Mm.
don't even have, they just call them Airbuses. They don't even
Yeah.
have those anymore. So that dates me, but I remember that flight.
Mm.
And I remember us getting our passport picture to go. And we waited until my little brother and I were out of school. And we flew well, we ended up in Tunbridge Wells
Yes.
outside of East Grinstead and stayed at the Harewood Hotel. So I have really strong memories of that period of time. And
Mm.
then they would come and pick up all the Scientologists and take them over to St. Hill. And my mother was, receiving training and auditing. And I think that she was enrolled in the St. Hill special briefing course.
Yeah, and that would be before they built the so-called castle. They were still working on that, and the courses would, I think, in '67 would still have been in the manor house.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember going to St. Hill I have very vague memories of it, but because we took the children's communication course there, and I have a certificate, I found that, in all of my parents' things of that children's communication course. So I have memories of walking around St. Hill. I don't really have any memories of taking that course, but I remember walking around and thinking how beautiful it was.
Yeah, it's a lovely place and full of squirrels. That was the thing I noticed particularly there, that
Oh,
there were lots and lots, high population of squirrels in the trees around, which I thought was funny when I went down there as a Scientologist.
yeah.
Nobody else seemed to think it was funny. But yeah, it's a lovely place. Um,
Were
so
you
it's
there in 1967?
no, that was a
No.
little bit. I was first there in 1975, so we missed each other there.
Okay. Okay.
But I I was down there for from September 75 to February 77, and then doing the academy levels and that sort of stuff. And then I went down to do OT levels in 1981. And then I left in 1983, but made the mistake of continuing to live in East Grinstead. It was only when I moved away in 1994 that I realized that the harassment dropped by 50% because people weren't coming out and doing their liability formulas by screaming at me and banging on my door and things like that. It was great leaving East Grinstead. And it's
Right. Lived
very,
in East Grinstead.
yeah,
Wow.
for 11 years the last time. And very divided town. After I'd written and published Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, shopkeepers would invite me in, shake my hand, give me free chocolates, and thank me for doing something about this awful blight on the town. And it really was, it was terrible. There's this idea of that Scientology is sort of, maintain friendly relations with the public and the environment, Hubbard says, but they were completely incapable of doing it. It was a law firm called Mason and Beer, and they pointed out, I had somebody who had a case through them, and they pointed out they'd been declared suppressive. And they were one of, I think, 22 businesses in East Grinstead that were declared suppressive. It's like, maintain friendly relations with the public and the environment. And I was told the story of the first fair game declare, which was a guy called Fred Hare, and he was chased through East Grinstead. They took this very literally. So he was physically chased, and you can imagine the poor inhabitants of the town going, "What on earth is going on here?" And not
Right.
not much seems to have changed. Only the last time I was there, which is about 10 years ago, it was like a ghost town. There were so many empty shops, and it was just this malaise had settled over the place, which you know could be
So
something to do with
sad.
Scientology. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So Fred Hare, was that the husband of Sylvia Hare?
Could well have been.
Could well have
You
been.
know,
Okay.
I have so many names that just in my memory. He's not
Yeah.
somebody I ever knew. I just remember that I was told that when Hubbard invented fair game, this idea of you could destroy people, they set about doing it physically. They set about causing him harm, and chased him through East Grinstead, which, for those who are not familiar with the topography, is actually 4 miles away from St. Hill. So they'd sort of taken pains to upset the locals, really. But there you
Right.
go. So
Right.
you from there, what other Scientology courses did you do? How were you involved?
Right. So from there, my mother and my little brother and I boarded the Royal Scotsman. So we
Ah,
didn't leave. We left St. Hill, but I think, my mother and I didn't speak of it much. Once we were all out, and I'll get to that part, we didn't
mm,
speak of it much. And so the memories that I have are the little bit that we spoke about it, and then childhood memories because I was 9. I do have memories of that period and talking to my little brother about what he remembers also. But we were in our school uniforms. We started going to school. and we went to, it's all Episcopal schools or, church schools in
Yeah.
England. And so we went to those schools, and my little brother and I went to the same church school, and I had my uniform on. And I remember my mother told us not to change and that we were going somewhere. And so she had packed everything in a almost like a steamer trunk,
Yeah.
and so all of her belongings, and it had our address. We had come from Louisiana. We were living in Louisiana at the time. And it had our address on there, and they put all of that in the car, and we drove for a very long time, and it was at night. And we drove to Southampton to board the ship. And it was very almost like a stealth mission. It was very, sneaky, and we had to be quiet, and no one was talking in the car. And then when we got there, I believe, it was a Scientologist who led us up the gangplank and told us we had to be very quiet, probably thought we were noisy, kids. And so we walked up and then walked down into the ship and went down to the berthing areas, where we would sleep. And my mother, tucked us into these metal bunk beds, I remember, and, put a wool blanket over us. And that was where, we spent that first night, which was the maiden voyage.
Yes,
And
absolutely. I was going to say that, as you say, it had been misnamed the Royal Scotsman, should have been the Royal Scotsman. And this it was a cattle ferry that would later become the flagship of Scientology, the Apollo. What an incredible thing to have been there. And was Hubbard aboard? Because, of course, he was banned from the UK at this time, but I know that he did sneak ashore at some point. Was he aboard the ship at that time, or did you pick him up along the way?
to my knowledge, he was on board because I remember going and performing. We were tutored on the ship. And so my little brother and I were tutored alongside the Hubbard kids.
Mm.
And Sylvia Hare was our tutor. That's why I asked about Fred Hare, because she was a Scientologist and an educator, by profession. And so she tutored us. And I remember we practiced a little song that we went and performed for Hubbard, in his quarters or in his dining quarters. It was different from, where we ate. But I remember that. And I clearly remember him being on the ship after the storm, in that we were cleaning up. All had to come up to the top deck, and it was a mess. There was water everywhere, and people were mopping and cleaning. And I clearly remember that and seeing him. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are my memories, that he was very much on board at that time. And Hannah Eltringham, who was
Yeah. That
yeah
was the
steering
first person I was going to ask about. Yeah, Hannah.
yeah steering the ship. I've read her recollection of it, and it was frightening. It was so
Mm.
frightening. And as a child, I don't remember feeling afraid. I mean, it was all so strange anyway, and I don't remember feeling afraid, but I remember the sounds, like the sounds of the engine room, because we were down lower, that we would have been close to that. So I remember that. And just like they said, that next day, and everything being such a mess, and everybody just having to clean up. And then I remember, we sailed through straight up Gibraltar. I remember that, everybody coming out on the ship, to see the land on either side. And we actually, we were in Sardinia and then also Valencia, Spain, and we were off-boarded in Valencia, because that's when all public, because there was public, and really wasn't the Sea Org yet, it was the Sea Project,
Yes. Yeah. With
right?
19 original members, quite a number of whom I've interviewed over the years. But yeah.
Yeah, the Jessups.
Yeah, I was briefly in touch with Amos Jessup. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and of
they
course,
were on board.
Nev Chamberlain was one of the original 19. Virginia Downsborough was the first person to be asked, and she declined. But, she'd seen
Uh,
what sort of state Hubbard was in when she went to Gran Canaria when he was doing
uh,
OT3, and she really was bothered about it. But
by that, yeah. But so we were off-boarded. So that was, public and kids had been in there, because we weren't the only children. There were some other children also,
mm,
that were there, I believe, with their parents. I saw very little of my mother on the ship, very
mm,
little, and I write about that in my book, Clearly Lies Are True, that she could not really come and see us, I don't think. I think that there was definitely rules in place. You know, we were being cared for, and we were had a nanny, I guess you would call her. You know, someone who oversaw us, the kids, and then also we were tutored, and so we saw very little of her, maybe at meals. And she wrote about the ethics conditions that she experienced while she was on the ship. Nothing as terrible as like the liability cruise and any of that. That hadn't started yet, but she made some testimonials about ethics and how beautiful ethics was, and that was what was needed to get the tech in. And yeah, really spoke to that period of time.
It is peculiar. I mean, so Quentin, Suzette, Diana, and Arthur were all there. What impression did you have of Ron Hubbard, of Mary Sue, and of the Hubbard family?
Well, the kids definitely, because we were tutored alongside them. So Arthur really he was always an artist, always. I remember him drawing. And so I don't remember him paying much attention to me or to the rest of us because he was very immersed in doing what he liked to do. Suzette, she was a little impish, you know, and she was not really engaged in the learning, but she was there. I remember that. Diana was not, because Diana was old enough to already be involved in, you know, what she needed to be doing on the ship in Scientology. And Quentin was sort of betwixt, and he was so sweet and so kind to me, so sweet and so kind. I remember him sharing with me. We took a walk, and he showed me where his quarters were on the ship. And his quarters were much nicer than my quarters because they were living in the nicer part of the ship. And he said to me, you know, don't you have something like this? You know, don't you have a bedroom like this or a cabin like this? And I said, no, we don't. And he was just so sweet and kind. And, you know, he was part of the Hubbard family because he had to be a Scientologist. But truly, I don't think, you know, and everything I've read about him, that was who he was.
Not at all.
You know, and the family, I think in so many ways, the children, I feel for them, and that they were, you know, taken out of this wonderful life that they'd had, you know, at St. Hill, where there was, you know, fields to run around it and horses and, you know, all kinds of lovely things that you want in childhood. And then the family was now on this ship, and that became their life, you know, and that was quite a culture shift for them. You know, that was a rude awakening for everybody.
Absolutely. And I mean, Hubbard did not prove to be a very good father and was not very attentive. I mean, that his second wife only found out that he had a first wife when she set about divorcing him, and found that the marriage had been bigamous, and found that he had 2 children already that she knew nothing about. And he'd abandoned them completely. He was actually ordered by the court to pay child maintenance and never did. So, with Mary Sue came along. She was, I think, 18, 19 when she met him. And there's a bizarre tape from 1952 called Battle of the Universes. All of the other Hubbard tapes I know, and there are far too many of them, let's face it, but all of the other ones are lectures. This one is just him and Mary Sue Whipp sat in a room talking. And she's got him on the e-meter. And it's this really curious relationship. There he is, you know, the great founder of Scientology, and it's 1952. He's been very successful to his own amazement with Dianetics, and then it's all gone terribly, awfully wrong. And he's left with a few tens of followers, really, by that time, you know, close followers, from having sold 150,000 copies of the book, Dianetics, which the publisher then withdrew because he considered it fraudulent. And he then commissioned Dr. Joseph Winter, who wrote the introduction to the original book, to write Dianetics, a doctor's report, saying, I think there might be something in Dianetics, but this guy is just awful. And we have the public projection of this man as you know, the world's greatest hero. Am I Maitreya? Am I the future Buddha who will save all of humanity? And the answer to that is no. He wasn't Maitreya. He's dead. and Matteo would have taken us all to nirvana. But so I've always thought of it's through the looking glass that what you see and what you're shown of Scientology is meant to be this wonderful thing where you can have these fantastic superpowers and you'll never be ill and everything will be happy. And then the other side of the looking glass is the true Ron Hubbard, whose motivation was absolutely other. He was a dreadful parent, and Quentin is the saddest story. You use the word sweet about Quentin. That's the word everybody uses about Quentin, that he was a perfectly charming person, that he liked other people. He didn't want, there's a policy letter that says he's the heir to Scientology in the 60s. And, he didn't want that. And of course, walked away from having had all of his certificates cancelled, his full OT7 and his class 12, all of them cancelled because he didn't want to do it. And of course, he was gay. And while his father, we now have significant evidence to show that Ron Hubbard engaged in homosexual relationships. Robert Heinlein, the science fiction author, was a very close friend of Hubbard's. Heinlein's wife wrote that she'd had sex with Hubbard and her husband had sex with Hubbard. And there are letters from his boyhood where he's talking about having sex with other boys. And yet there was this public idea of how evil, all homosexuals are covertly hostile. They're all backstabbers. And poor Quentin, so he's lost in this. He doesn't want to be the successor to a tyrant. He is not finding any real benefit in Scientology itself. But I talked with somebody who'd been in the Guardian's office and had seen the documents that the FBI took in 1977. And among them, they had documents about Quentin, and which showed that there'd been a branch of the Guardian's office, which is called Branch 4, and it's not otherwise mentioned anywhere else that I know of. They carried guns, and they would go into the gay bars, wherever Quentin might go, and show a picture of Quentin to the owner, show them a gun and say, something bad will happen to you if you ever let this young man in. So he had all of this conflict, and it's difficult enough being gay in our society as it is. Had all of this conflict going on. His father pretending that he was a straight down the line heterosexual, and being forced out of life. A friend of mine knew him quite well towards the end of his life, and just said he was he was not the most intellectual of human beings, but he was absolutely considerate and concerned about others, which is something you could never accuse his father of being, sadly.
Not at all. No, that's fascinating. I did not know all of that. I did see Quentin after we left the Royal Scotland and we came to Los Angeles because I was at the original Celebrity Center.
With Ivon Gillum.
With Ivon Gillum gents, yeah. And he was flown in from the ship. So it was the Apollo by that time, because it was the 70s. Yeah. And he came, and it was as if the prince had come, Hubbard was the king and Quentin was the prince. And I remember we were just all like preparing for the visit and everything. And, all these people swarming around him. And he was not there for the accolades. I mean, that was not who he was. But he was just so kind to everyone. And I remember that he remembered me, and I looked different because I was a teenager by that time and not a little girl anymore. And he was so sweet. He was just so sweet. And I said, I'm just so glad you came. And he said, oh, it's so good to see you. And I hope you are well. And, your mom and your dad. And that's just who he was. That's just who he was. And so sad, to think about it in terms of, in the 70s, it was hard to come out if you were gay.
Oh, yeah.
My own father was bisexual, which is so interesting, that history that you share about Hubbard, because my father had many secrets that he had to keep. And not only to come out as gay, though, in the 70s, but also that, he was in a cult, Quentin, that he didn't want to be in. He was having to believe in things that were probably so opposite from who he wanted to be.
Yeah. And all of the kids saw Ron Hubbard as he really was. Probably none as much as his oldest son, Nibs, who for 7 years was his sort of henchman. I think that's the right word. Who was inducted into the ritual magic by his father, and was the only person who was. And I think and in 1959, after 7 years of working for his dad and putting together courses with him, there are bulletins that they just scrubbed out the junior from. So, for example, training routine 6 to 9, the original issue is Ron Hubbard Jr., the upper indoctrination TRs. And so they just scrubbed that off. Same way that they took David Mayo's name off things and just put Ron Hubbard's name on them. And that was the only alteration of bulletins on the OT5 materials, that they'd just be renamed. There were 6 of them that were written by Mayo, and they just put Hubbard's name on them. But so L. Ron Hubbard Jr. was very active and saw his father behind the mask. But Quentin saw that real change, you could call it a sea change, I suppose, that came over Hubbard once he was away from land, and he was completely the boss. He could do whatever he wanted, and so started throwing people overboard in the harbour at Corfu in 1968. I talked with so many people over the years about that. And of course, in the Auditor number 41, there's a picture of somebody being thrown overboard and a photo credit to L. Ron Hubbard. So there's no denying it. They published this thing. But it was only a couple of years ago I was talking to Karen de la Carrière, and she said when they threw them overboard in Corfu, I mean, it's from quite a height, much higher than the high diving board, and with your ankles tied and a blindfold on. Many of them were non-swimmers. But what I hadn't realised, you're going into the water of the harbour, and the harbour is where all of the ships discharge their sewage.
It's dirty.
And so you're going, he did what? He came to save humanity. He was this wonderful messianic saintly figure. And to get that once he'd got people aboard the Avon River and the Royal Scotsman, the Enchanter, that he became a complete tyrant. And Quentin lived around that. And I have the sense that poor Diana, I think, was just crushed into it to become his instrument. Suzette left, Arthur left, and Quentin, of course, took his own life to get away from it. And they're selling courses on how to improve your family relationships.
It's so tragic. Yeah, it's so tragic. I do remember my parents speaking of Nibs. I never really knew who that was. I always used to think it was maybe an uncle or something. They didn't, but I remember them. They didn't tell me who it was, but I remember them talking about it a little bit. And so I think that in 1959, when they left, like I said, Hubbard had already, gone over to the UK, and they were not going to follow there. And so that's when, we moved. And it was the period of time when franchises could happen.
Well, they should be called missions.
Right. So they grew
franchise is more accurate. You pay 10%.
Right. So I think in the 60s it was franchises, and then they moved into missions maybe in the 80s or later after that.
It was by the 70s that I first went to the Scientology mission in 1974 in Birmingham. But the two terms by then had become almost interchangeable. I mean, it is like there's an issue called "What Your Donations Buy," but the first publication of it said "What Your Fees Buy," and it was in the whole thing of trying to get tax exemption, changing the wording. So franchises sounds too much like McDonald's, so they became missions. But they still paid their 10%, and of course were a brilliant recruiting ground, because the organizations, and the Sea Organization in particular, have always had terrible problems recruiting people. Whereas the atmosphere of the missions, the franchises, which was fairly convivial, fairly friendly, they were able to recruit people and then send them on to be fleeced royally later on.
Exactly. I don't know if you are familiar with the names John and Millie Galusha.
Yes.
So Yes. Okay. So that's who my parents followed to Colorado because they had been at the founding Church of Scientology and they started their franchise in the Denver area.
Yeah.
And, and the history with the Galushes, how it morphed into Identics, which was his own version of what he had learned.
Yeah. One of, we counted about 200 splinter groups, some of them very famous, like Erhard Seminar Training Est, Landmark the Forum,
Hmm.
and some of the, Dianology, Ampronistics,
Right.
Educativism, the Enlightenment Intensive out of Abilitism by Chuck Berner or there were so many people that it's now the situation that there is almost no group out there that's not been affected by having Scientology injected into it. So, for example, the Church of I Am, Ramtha, when people defected from Scientology in 82, 83, a lot of them joined the channeling movement. So even groups that don't seem to have anything to do with Scientology were then reorganized, often being given little chunks of Scientology's bizarre ethics technology, so-called technology, or some other aspect of Scientology. With the I Am movement, I think it was a lot of it was the administrative structure of Scientology that suddenly was there and was taken on. But or even something like, say, Eckankar, which is about fairies and things like that. Paul Twitchell, who founded it, used to write bulletins for Hubbard. And again, originally they had Paul Twitchell written on them, professional auditors bulletins. Now they say Ron Hubbard. Tremendously influential. So yes, John Galusha with Identics was one
Yeah.
of the significant defectors.
Yes.
Did your
Yes.
parents remain involved with him in Identics, or did they stay with Scientology?
Just with Scientology, we were only in Denver for a few years. And so that's when, he had started the franchise. And so they did not get involved with Identics. That was later.
Mm.
Um, but that's why they moved to Denver. So that's why we left DC. And so it was that period of time when I think the, small group, the Hubbard Association of Scientologists that my parents were part of, had to make decisions. Were they going to follow Hubbard or were they going to start their franchises and, do their own thing? So that's what happened. And then we moved to the South. We moved to Louisiana for my father's work. There was a plant that had started the Michoud plant, and it was part of NASA. And
Yep.
so, we went so my father could work there, a little tiny town outside of New Orleans. So not a lot of Scientology was happening there. So that was sort of a reprieve for my mother. I think for my father, my father was the true believer. My
Mm.
father was the true believer, but my mother was the problem because there always has to be, right, a ruin, something that has to get fixed. And so it was, couldn't be my father, so it had to be my mother.
Mm.
And that was her journey. And that's when my father said, you need to go to St. Hill. And that's why we were at St. Hill and then on the Royal Scotsman. And then we came home for a minute. And then they decided that my mother needed to go to Los Angeles, where the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles had just opened. And then the American St. Hill,
Mm.
Hubbard Association, ASHO, started later around that period of time. And so she flew out on her own and we stayed back with my father so that she could come out and continue working on her case. So that was another big culture shock for us, as a family and as kids. So we came out to LA in 1968 and followed, my mother. We did a cross-country road trip. My father drove, and he was an all or nothing person, so it was like a 3 to 4 day event that should have probably taken weeks to actually, do it in a normal amount of time. So I remember that trip and just a lot of driving, going through the deserts. And when we got to LA, we had moved from Denver, where we lived in a suburb, and then to Louisiana, where we lived in a suburb, and then to Los Angeles. My parents, when we left Louisiana, sadly, their home was foreclosed on. They had lost all of their money. they had, put it all into Scientology. And so when we moved to LA, we lived in downtown Los Angeles near the organizations, which were all housed in the old Craftsman's, down in downtown LA. And we lived in an apartment building, not far from Olympic and Vermont, if you know that area at all, but it was right down where the orgs were.
Mm.
Yeah. So that was, as a kid, you don't reflect on that until you get older. So, I never really thought about it in terms of, oh, we didn't have a house anymore.
Yeah.
It was just like the next adventure with living with parents who were Scientologists. And many Scientologists lived in that building, many non-Scientologists as well. But that was where Charity and Doreen Smith lived before she left, to go and be one of the Commodore's messengers.
Yeah.
Yeah, during that period of time. And I remember, interacting with her a little bit. She was a little older than I was by a couple of years. I think I was 10 and she was about 12 when she went and started, participating in Scientology that way. But, she was born and raised into Scientology as well. So I did not get active in Scientology until we moved to a different part of LA, which was near Asho. So the American Saint Hill, organization, and that had opened. And I really think that had a lot to do with what was going on with my mother's case. So when we were there in 68, 69, when we first came to LA, in hindsight, as a kid, I didn't know what courses she was taking. But in speaking to Scientologists now, I believe that it probably would have been OT3, which is the Xenu story. Is that correct?
It is. Yes.
It is, yeah. So she had some psychotic episodes. And many Scientologists have said to me, most likely, that might have been the catalyst for that. But she was taken out of our apartment because of the psychosis that she was going through. And she was put in, like a Scientology safe house, which was really just another apartment building that was, close to the orgs. And I remember going to visit her there. And she had kind of a handler, that was there with her. And we got to talk to her a little bit, my dad and I. But it took her a while to leave there and then to come back home to our original apartment. And she suffered for many, many years from agoraphobia after that. And she could not go out. She could not engage in life. Yeah. It was really tough. It was really tough for her and tough for us. And so I really think, John, that we moved to the other apartment building closer to Asho because I think they were shuffling her around.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened so often. The procedure is called baby watching. If it seems they might be a threat to Scientology in terms of publicity, then they're put under guard and they're held. And many years ago, early 90s, I was asked to give a talk at Haywards Heath Mental Institution. And so I went along. I was very surprised. There were 14 staff there. Now, I know that the people in these hospitals work long hours. And so the thought that 14 of them cared enough and wanted to know why it was that every few months they would get somebody from St. Hill. And this was not something we were ever told in Scientology. And they just had a guy there, a German guy, and he'd done OT3, that much they'd found out. And it was generally OT3. And it was, I never took on to the anti-psychiatry thing. I campaigned against ECT. I was a fan of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But I happened as a teenager to have known a psychiatrist and got to know her reasonably well. And she was not the blood-dripping monster destroying all life in the universe that Ron Hubbard insisted all psychs are. So I didn't have that. But there was still some apprehension on my part going to a psychiatric hospital to talk to these people. And I was amazed at the level of care and concern that I met. They really wanted to understand. This guy had torn off his clothes off. He'd wiped his excrement over the walls. He'd screamed and physically tried to attack anybody that came in. I said, well, look, he's terrified. He's been told that you are the agents of evil, and that you will drug him and give him shocks and all of this stuff. So the best thing you can do if you get a Scientologist is to assure them that you're not going to give them any psychiatric drugs. You're going to let them calm down. So even the sedatives or tranquilizers they'd normally give, don't try and give them anything. And after 3 or 4 days, they'll probably calm down, because what you're looking at is an acute psychosis brought on by OT3. Since then, I've met a number of people who had terrible reactions to OT3. Indeed, one of the women I knew at the Birmingham Moseley mission that I came in through, who was one of the most charming and ebullient people I've ever met. She was just wonderful. And I didn't see her for about 4 years. And I was then doing the OT levels and being a little bit disappointed, I have to admit, by the content. What on earth is this nonsense? And I met her again, and she was just, I mean, they're rigid. You know, they use the word rigid in Scientology to mean somebody who's just solid and stuck. And she'd been this really cheerful, charismatic person, and she was really distressed. And a couple of years later, when I left, she briefly came out and told me that she couldn't find any body thetans, any little spirits on OT3. And so she'd been pulled progressively further and further down, told that there was something wrong with her because she couldn't imagine these little creatures. And that thought that you find yourself in the context, you know, in a society where madness is adopted, and if you don't go along with it, then this will happen to you. But it's certainly an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. And I mentioned Virginia Downsborough before. She was called to Gran Canaria by Ron Hubbard at the very beginning of 1967, around about, may even have been December 66. And he got this panicked message for her to come and help him. And she said, I interviewed her in Santa Barbara. I interviewed her twice in 86 and 88. And she said that when she got there, he was out of his mind. He was no longer eating. He wouldn't drink anything because he was sure that he was going to be poisoned. And she said he had a shelf full of drugs. That was all he was taking. And this was, you know, I had heard his book 86. I'd interviewed a few people, and I'd heard about his use of barbiturates, which he admits to. There's a lecture, you know, that's been published by Scientology where he talks about being a guinea pig in an experiment to come off phenobarbital. And his medical records show that he was taking this very strong drug, a real downer, something that. And he also, of course, recommended the use of amphetamines in 1950 and 51. Even the book Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health, has a recommendation that you take amphetamines. So there's no doubt that he took these drugs. But she was saying he had a shelf load of these things. He was convinced that the body thetans were taking him over, that he couldn't stop this from happening. And this is why she kind of went, she didn't really want to join the Sea Project and be a part of what was going to happen next. Curiously, at the very end of his life, in Lawrence Wright's excellent book, Going Clear, he interviews a guy called Stephen Sarge Fouth, who was a kind of handyman at the property where Hubbard spent his last 5 or 6 years. And he says that he was called in by Hubbard at one point, who asked to make a special e-meter that would kill him, but separate him from all of the body thetans that had taken over. So at the very end of his life, he was still in this psychosis of, you know, this multiple identity, which he'd been living with certainly since, I mean, I believe throughout Scientology. I think that his first, you can trace it back to probably, certainly as far as 1945, that he'd started to believe that, in fact, there's a point where he told somebody that he had seen the Empress, who is his holy guardian angel, on the wing of his glider airplane when he was at college. So he'd have been about 20 when he first started having these other beings involved with him. You're kind of going, and from there, he created this modern science of mental health. and caught people up in that. So how terrible for your mother. What became of her? What was her story from there? Did she get things back
From
together
there,
again?
yeah. She eventually did. I
Mm.
just love, what you just shared. It's like the mad scientist succumbing to his madness, right?
Mm.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's Hubbard, that's his story.
Yeah.
And sadly, bringing everybody down with him because, they've all drunk the Kool-Aid and agreed that, this is all the truth.
Yeah.
So I think what happened to my mother during that period of time is she she so she was taken in at ASH show. She was going very little because of the agoraphobia. So she was
Mm.
going as much as she could muster to get there. They weren't sending Scientologists to the home. I know that, but she was getting there. And she also did some writing during that period of time and some things that I found actually when I was a teenager and didn't really make much sense of them at the time, but later as an adult, it's made a lot of sense to me, is she wrote her withholds, and her overts out, which we have to do in Scientology, all the evil things and terrible things that we've done, or our omissions, things we haven't done. And so the list, and I included in my memoir, is really her kind of revelations in some ways about Scientology, because
Mm.
she says, and my father's name was Paul, I've told Paul that Scientology is bad. I've nattered, which is, bitched and moaned, about the ASH show staff. And then a long list of things that she hadn't done in regards to us as children, which was very sad. Like, she didn't go to doctor's appointments with us. She didn't go to school conferences because of her agoraphobia. I mean, she had a lot of guilt about that. But really, the gist of it was that she had been trying to tell my father how bad Scientology was and
Mm.
to get out for a very long time then.
Yes.
I think that seed had been planted probably after Denver,
Yeah.
and she had those reprieves, and then she was forced back in pretty much by my father, you're the problem, we've got to keep fixing you. And what happened, it was in the early 1970, 71. My father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
Oh.
And sadly, he probably had the disease for years, but the
Mm.
diagnosis finally happened then, and he was wheelchair bound very quickly. And
Oh.
then he had to go to a convalescent center because my mother could not take care of him. He did some rehab. He was a veteran, and so he got some care at the Veterans Administration. So all of that happened, and my mother, had to go to work because there was no one
Mm.
to, fend for us. There was no one to, to bring in an income and to make sure that we were financially, taken care of anymore. My father got some disability checks, but we really plunged into kind of a family of poverty.
Mm.
And I didn't reflect on this until later also, that I remember we'd go and it was, it wasn't the EBT card they give you now, but it was food stamps.
Yeah.
And we were issued food stamps. I remember going to the market, with my parents, and they would load up the cart with like as much as you could possibly buy, with the food stamps, because you only got them once a month.
Mm.
And it was tough. Those were
Mm.
not good years, for my mother. But crazily enough, John, without the help of Scientology, she was able to overcome the agoraphobia.
Mm.
And she found some books, actually. She shared one with me later in life that was written by a woman, not a Scientologist, but who had dealt with agoraphobia and kind of her step by step techniques for
Yeah.
overcoming that, which was, that gradual getting out and trying things and, overcoming it little by little. And she had to go to work. And so she started working, she started driving. And as that happened, Scientology had already kind of loosened its hold on her.
Mm.
And I think a lot of that had to do with what exactly you said before about psychosis and baby watching
Mm.
and not wanting any bad media. They only want wins. They don't want you to report anything other than wins
Mm.
and that things are going well. So she did do some beginning work with ASHO of dictating It was back when dictaphones, when you would, speak into the little tape, and they would be transcribed. And she did a little bit of that work for ASHO, which is interesting, before she got another job. And so I think that she was paid for some of that. So she got out into the work world. She left Scientology. My father got sick, and I was voluntold. I was told, you're going to go get involved in Scientology. So I was 13. And I was volunteered to go and work at Celebrity Center. So in the summers, because I went to school, during the school year. And I know it wasn't my choice because I didn't really have any interest in it. I'd never done much, outside of besides what my parents had done. And so I would walk from our apartment all the way down to Celebrity Center, which was in another part of downtown LA. And I actually enjoyed it in the beginning, because I was young. I was 13. It gave me some freedom. I could go out on my own. Things were not really great at home. My dad was sick, and my mom, had started working and had all these health issues. And it was fun. Ivon Gillum, everything that you read about her is true. I mean, she was delightful, just delightful. She was so positive. And we were doing the work of, because the American Organization of Los Angeles, AOLA had opened and ASHO had opened, and now Celebrity Center. And so they needed to get all of their files together on everyone that was involved in those organizations to make sure that there weren't duplicates, and to just, make sure that their database was up to date. Yeah. And so it was back in the day when it was Rolodex. So it wasn't on a computer or anything like that. And so myself and another teenager, I remember, Tristan Romero was his name, standing side by side with him, and we'd pick up a Rolodex card, and then we'd have to cross-reference it with the other organizations and see if there were duplicates. And it was so tedious. It was the most tedious task you could do. But Ivon would come in and she would say, "How are you two today? You're doing such a great job. We're so glad you're here." And she was just so positive. She was just so positive. So that was my path. I started there. And then I went on to I took training courses there, and I was audited, and I became an auditor.
Okay.
And I was very young. I was very young. I was 14, 15 years old. And in hindsight, I look back on that and I think that was kind of strange, but no one balked at it. No one balked at it at all in the organizations. I mean, I talk about in my book, we're all thetans in the world of Scientology, which is likened a bit to souls. And so you're just, a thetan in a little body. You're just a thetan in a child's body, and you've lived a million lives anyway. So you've got this, how to do it already. We're just reactivating all that knowledge. So I liked it in that I was treated like an adult, and I was a teenager. And so what teenager doesn't want to be treated like an adult?
Yeah, you'd have a certain respect. I mean, Ivon Gillum is one of the great tragedies, because, as you say, nobody has a hard word to say about Ivon. Everybody who met her loved her. And yet Ron Hubbard destroyed her relationship with her own children by taking the 3 children from her and creating, they were the original Commodore's messengers. I've talked with Janice, and I have tremendous respect for what she's written and what she's said. But this thought that, at 11 years old, she's on the ship. At 12, she and her siblings are the first 3 messengers. They're denied an education. They're enslaved. And from what she's said, it's fairly clear. I mean, Peter Gillum and Ivon Gillum had separated anyway, but Hubbard kept those children away from the parents. He wanted Ivon to be this bright, shiny person who would bring him new recruits. He didn't want her wasting time on being a parent. And so the people who needed her the most, her own children, didn't have her. And they didn't have her because she thought that without Scientology, the world was going to die. This whole agonized future of every man, woman, and child on this earth depends on what we do here in Scientology. This push that's going on all the time, and she became convinced of that. And yet So she must have been struggling all the time because she was a very loving person and she evidently loved her children. The children were taken from her and she's having to put on this brave front all the time and, make sure that John Travolta and the other various celebrities all stay in and do what they're doing. Was Spanky Taylor there at that time? Do you
I
remember
don't
Spanky?
remember her, no,
No.
because I think it was after that. Because I know so I connected with Janice about 10 years ago
Mm.
when I first started, writing and thinking about this story and that I
Yeah.
needed to tell, and read Janice's story. And like you said, it's an amazing story,
Mm.
and realized that we were literally ships in the night. We off-boarded and they onboarded.
Yeah.
It's so crazy to think that. And I always, I talk about that in my story too, about I was strong-armed to get into the Sea Org, and thank goodness I didn't,
Yeah.
because, that would have been my life. And had my mother chosen, at that time to continue on, if she had decided, oh yes, this is what, this is my mission,
Mm.
and I'm going to buy into it. She didn't, thankfully, and
No.
we were able to offboard. But I think for Ivon, she was such a loyal
Mm.
Scientologist, in spite of all of that evilness, that happened. It's, Hubbard, because he couldn't have her and he wanted things to go the way that he wanted, such a narcissist, he
Oh,
had
yeah.
to keep from her the very thing that was, her prized possessions, her children,
Mm.
right? So it was so cruel. It was so cruel, but you would never know that. I mean, I had
Mm.
no idea any of that was happening when I was there, because she was so devoted to the mission of Scientology
Yeah.
and to the mission of Celebrity Center. And she saw it as a grand task that she was going to be successful with,
Mm.
because that's who she was. She was going to make it the best that it could be. And she was going to, always have a good time with it. That was Ivon.
Mm.
She wanted to make it enjoyable, and so great things happened. I mean, there were poetry readings and,
Mm.
plays that were put on by up and coming artists. And
Mm.
it was a really magical place when it first started, because it was
Mm.
so small and grassroots, and everyone was there under Yvonne's guidance to make the best things happen, because that's who she was. So it had that feel. Not that bad things didn't happen, they happen all the time in Scientology, so things were happening. But that was also the period of time when Ray Midoff was starting his Scientology journey. So he came to Celebrity Center when I was there. He and then Gelda, his wife, his
Mm.
girlfriend at the time. And Ray was a trainer and an auditor of mine. So I had some interactions with him. And I didn't realize until doing my research and starting to tell my story how he had risen to the upper echelons of
Mm.
Scientology. I had no idea.
Yeah, the TechSec International or something like that. But a lot of the later material that's attributed to Hubbard was actually written by Mithoff. It was his job to take, because if I've understood it correctly, from very early on, every sound that Hubbard made was recorded. He had a voice activated recorder. And in 1993, I think it was in LA, and I interviewed a guy called Ken Rose, who had been the head of Ron's technical compilations. And he had all of the lectures, and there are perhaps 3,500 recorded lectures, and all of these daily tapes. And he was saying, it's just that, what were you going to do with all of this material? So Mithoff would be given little chunks of this material and told to put them into a bulletin. So I mean, the book that I'm just about to publish is really based upon one Hubbard Bulletin, and that is the introductory bulletin to the highest level of Scientology, Operating Thetan Section 8 course. And this bulletin was only on the course for a week. The end of a week, it was withdrawn, and it is. I'd seen it before it went on the course. It had leaked out. Somebody had got to Hubbard and got a copy of this thing as he was sort of falling into dementia at Creston, where he died. Somebody had managed to get this from him, a guy called Steve Fishman, and he'd released it and said, this is what OT8 is. And I remember getting a copy of it probably just a few months before the OT8 course and reading it and going, look, this is what Hubbard thinks, but there's no way he would tell people. You know, I'd done enough research into his background to know without any doubt that he was involved with Crowleyite sex magic and had tried to bring about Armageddon. You know, in 1946, from January to March, he did occult ceremonies to try and to stop the second coming of Christ, to stop this. Now, you know, I'm an agnostic. I have no skin in this game at all. But in this bulletin, you've got the statement that he is here to aid Lucifer and the Antichrist in their work. And he's going to reincarnate as a political leader the next time. He's nearly done. The bulletin is dated 5th of May, 1980. And that the second coming is actually a Markabian invasion. And this is going to happen. So I decided to take this as the premise to say, okay, if Scientology took over the world, the secret behind Scientology is the fear of the Markabians. And I found 4 references in open text from Hubbard, which just seemed to be quite jovial. And I then knew Captain Bill Robertson quite well after he left. And really, you know, he kept coming along and trying to persuade me to get back in Scientology. And I kept going, not a chance, really not interested after seeing doing the OT levels, have no interest in Scientology whatsoever. But he went on and on and on about the Markabians, and I thought that was just him. So when I later saw this bulletin, and then when it was confirmed by 2 people who'd done the OT8 course, and they said, yes, it was on the original OT8 course. And you kind of, this is just whack. He's saying the purpose of Scientology is to stop Christ's return to earth. That's it. That's what I'm here for. What's confirming it in it is he says that he first got the idea of this in 1945. And that is Hubbard, because that's the year he met Jack Parsons, with whom he'd performed these ceremonies. So that's accurate. But the rest of it is Ray Mitoff trying to stitch this stuff together to make some sort of sense out of it. Evidently, of course, if Scientology did take the world over, you and I would be Markabians. Right?
Might be better than being Scientologists.
Yeah, it has been a lot better, I must say.
Right.
Being a Scientologist was not something that I enjoyed tremendously. It was very difficult. The worst part of it was trying to conform, to become self-determined by thinking exactly what Ron thought. It was like, this isn't self-determined. And these, the idea that you brought up before, that you're a Thetan, and so from the moment you're born you're actually you've got millions of lifetimes and all of this stuff. There's a point where they got stuck on the ship. There were about 200 crew at the time, and they got stuck because they're in a Spanish port and there was nobody on board the ship who spoke Spanish. And you're kind of going, so Hubbard had never had a life where he spoke Spanish. Now, that's kind of weird on a planet where it's the third language. But there was nobody on the ship who could suddenly speak Spanish. And you go, well, this kind of falsifies what we're looking at here. This is not, in fact, true. And it led to deplorable treatment of children, generally, particularly the Sea Orchids, and especially at St. Hill and Los Angeles, where they ran wild. They were feral. And the usual complaint was we could never get enough to eat. We were being starved, and you're kind of going, this is the group that's the most ethical group on the planet, and they're starving their own children.
Right, right, yeah.
While Hubbard is having his shirts made in Savile Row and handmade cigarettes and, black swans and Aberdeen Angus bulls on his ranch and a 24-track recording studio and 2,000 camera pieces. He's not allowing his own crew to have toilet tissue, and he's not allowing them to. And this thing of splitting parents from their children, and splitting up marriages, he was just doing that all the time as a way of controlling people. But
Right. It was always about control. And so that's sort of, what happened in 75. So I was, a part-time Scientologist because I was in school. So I would do it at night, or in the summers and weekends. And then, as a teenager, I started to get involved with other, activities, boys, going out with friends and things like that. And so I had started less and less to participate, I kind of on my own, I was kind of like a hybrid in between. And I was in our apartment and my boyfriend at the time was there and my mother was not there. And the Scientologists came to my apartment door, two guys, and they knocked on the door and I opened it. And prior to that, they had really given me the hard sell to join the Sea Org. That's what their mission was, and that was really when the Sea Org had started to take off as well. The people started to come from the Apollo in their uniforms and, the case supervisors, were sent to make sure all the tech was going in correctly and everything was, done up to snuff. And so it was that era. And so they gave me the hard sell and they said, you can sign the billion. I said, I'm not 18. You can sign the billion-year contract, even though you're 16, without your parents' permission. And so I, tucked that away and had a fight with my mom about it. So prior to these Scientologists showing up, I had this fight with my mom. I'd come home and I was going to pack up my pillowcase, basically, stuffing all my stuff in there, and I was going to go. I was ready. It was going to be better than living at home. I was a teenager. I was rebellious, and my mother went crazy. She was screaming and yelling at me, and then she threatened. She said, "I'm going to call the police." She said, "If you try to go, I'm going to call the police." And I really didn't know if she would or not. She was pretty upset, and she was pretty mad about it. And so we had this fight, and I kind of reconsidered a little for that day and said, okay, maybe she might. I don't want to, have that happen. I don't want to get arrested for this. And she said to me, what do you think is going to happen if you join the Sea Org? And I said, well, it's going to be great. I'm going to make money and I'm going to have friends. And, I'm thinking of all the adults that I see there and, all the things that they get to do. And I'm thinking, I can be an adult and I can have that life. And she chopped that down pretty quickly. She said, do you know how much they make? Do you know what their conditions are like? And she kind of gave me a reality check about it. And I decided, okay, for right now, I'm not going to do that. And when these Scientologists came to the door, that was their purpose. We haven't seen you around, where have you been? And they were wanting, to give me the hard sell again. But I think because my boyfriend was there and he's very tall, he might have been intimidating. And I write that, they're kind of like bullies that don't have any superpowers when they're not, connected to their organization, when they're out in the what we call WOG world, of real people. And so, they left me alone. But I dodged a bullet. I dodged a bullet, and thank goodness my mother, had the clarity and had gotten away enough of her own, she'd pulled herself away enough. And my father was not there to say, because he probably would have said to go. If he had still been there, he would have pushed me to do that. So I dodged a bullet. So that was the end of my Scientology career, pretty much. Years later, though, when, you said what had become of my mother. So my father passed when I was 19. He died. And then my mother, she was married to someone for a brief period, not a Scientologist, and then divorced that person. And at the end of her life, she shared with me that she was dating a Scientologist. And it was at one of my children's birthday parties. And I remember I looked at her and I had pretty much buried everything, John. I had said, okay, that's over. That, it didn't happen. And I'm moving on with my life, I'm an educator. So becoming an educator and a parent. And when she said that to me, I looked at her and I thought, you're crazy. Why would you date, a Scientologist? And she said, I said to her, Mom, I don't want to talk about it. I said, that period of my life, that was a nightmare. I don't want to talk about it. And she said, oh, okay. I didn't know you felt that way. And so that was the end of it. We really never spoke of it, sadly. I wish I had. Now I have so many questions. But I learned that the person that she was dating was Don Breeding, who is the original inventor of the e-meter.
Or one of them.
Or one of them. There
It
you
actually
go.
stretches back quite a long way. Jung used one in the 1920s. Volney Matheson gave Hubbard the one, and then Don Breeding worked on that to perfect it.
Exactly.
I think it's that way around. Yeah.
Exactly. So they had met in the 50s, when at the Church of Scientology when my parents were there. So they had met years and years ago and somehow reconnected in Los Angeles. And I thought that was wild. They went to the very first, it was the Hubbard Library that was opened, and they went to that event together. And I'm sure my mother brought books and all of that. So sadly, she died pretty shortly after that. She had a massive stroke. She had a brain aneurysm, and she passed. Yeah, she was here one day and gone the next. So that was very sad, very, very sad. And that I really never got to mend my relationship with her. And sad that, she had such a tragic ending to her life.
Yeah.
But I reached out to Don Breeding. I found her address book and I reached out to him after she passed and asked, I think I wanted to bring some closure, John. I didn't know what to do for her. I just thought it was so sad. All those years she'd spent in Scientology and now she was, dating somebody again. Like what was her thinking? I was probably trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
And he shared, they had, reconnected, and he produced an old timers newsletter. So this is before, the internet, before even PDFs or anything like that. So it was a paper newspaper. And I told him, about my mom and kind of her journey since Scientology, and he knew some of it, but that she had written poetry and she had written some poetry about Scientology. And so he told her story in that newsletter, and he reproduced her poem, which I also include in my story. And it was sort of a full circle moment, a little closure in a way that I thought could honor her in her journey, because her poem was a very positive one. It's about thetans and it's about, dreams, basically, and about, what kind of reality you want in life. And it was touching that he did that, but he wrote about her. And, that's the really last contact that I've had, with anybody in Scientology for all these years until, like I said, about 10 years ago, I reached out to Janice Gillum Grady.
Yeah.
And then the story has gone on and on and on. I've met so many in the ex-Scientology community now. It's such a great community of people.
Yeah, and a very sizable community of people. There are a lot of ex-Scientologists. There are a lot more ex-Scientologists than there are members of the International Association of Scientology, which has shrunk to about 20,000 people now, being fueled by the billionaires. So the Duggans, Bob and Trish Duggan, are reckoned to have given $360 million. And it's no longer able to recruit. They're basically trying to get members to give their children as, the next crop of SEALG members. Tragic that there are still 4,000 SEALG members, thereabouts, who are slaves. For all practical purposes, psychologically and physically, they're slaves. They are not self-determined, that promise that L. Ron Hubbard gave. They've, of course, signed a 1,000 million year contract to follow and uphold command intention, which is to say to be other determined in Hubbard's terms. So this, through the looking glass, we go to that metaphor again, that it is the opposite of what it seems to be. Is your book available yet?
Great question. No, it's in production. So thanks for asking about that. So it's Clearly Lies Are True, and I'm hoping for a summer publication date. And I'll be sure to let everybody know. I'm on Instagram and I'm on TikTok, and you can read all about me and my story. And that's at Clearly Lies Are True. And I have a website as well with the same name, clearlyliesartrue.com. So it's been a journey, John. Like I said, I had no idea 10 years ago when I, hooked up with Janice. My hope was that maybe someone in the ex-Scientology community, she was having an event, might have known my parents. And I think I was seeking closure for myself at that time. My parents were older, so that didn't happen. And because were on the Royal Scotland for such a short period of time, and my mother didn't join the Sea Org, we didn't have that connection, and because I never joined. But I've realized that there is, like you said, just this beautiful community of ex-Scientologists, such positive people, such caring people, such giving people. They've been helping me with my story, and you're helping me to share my story. And I never would have imagined that. Never, ever would have imagined that. I just needed to heal from what happened to me. I also, and I don't want to get into it with this interview, but I was sexually abused by my father when I was a young child as well. And so the part of those memories started to come up. So that's what started to happen is I had a trauma happen about 15 years ago, and then it activated those repressed memories. And that's what made me write it all.
Yeah.
And that's when it just all started coming out, and things that I had forgotten about and I had pushed down and I had chosen, not to think about for so long. So it's been a journey. It's been a journey that's been well worth it, just in meeting so many people that are so supportive. And everyone has a story in Scientology. Everyone has a story, and many of those stories are so sad. So sad. I mean, tragic stories. And, mine is not nearly as tragic as so many, but it's one more that can maybe help people. One more that can maybe help someone who's gone through dysfunction in their family, not maybe even with Scientology, but some kind of a cult. Like you said, there's so many connections.
Yes. And it is important that thriving survivors are there, because there is such a phobia built into any of the thousands of authoritarian groups out there. They all induce the phobia that when you leave, the devil will get you, or things will go wrong, these terrible things. And of course you get out and find that in fact, no, people get on with their lives. And the thought that you have to heal after Scientology. It doesn't just go away. It doesn't just evaporate. And that's different for different people. A lot of people, I'm not a tremendous fan of Kubler-Ross's ideas of grieving, but I think they can be applied in this situation, that people will often simply deny that anything happened. Nothing happened to me. It didn't affect me in any way. And that means it's in the background of their lives from that time onwards. They'll still have those strange concepts that come from Hubbard, that twisted way of looking at the world. Then they may go into being angry about it. And we see huge conflict going on, courtesy of the internet, between certain factions of the ex-member community. And people feel deserving. They feel entitled to be unpleasant to other people because they were traumatized. Viktor Frankl talks about that when he came out of Auschwitz, that there was another inmate there who started thrashing down the corn with a stick. And he said, after what's happened to me, I can do whatever I like. And some people will have that, that we are such a large community with such experience. My concern is that people should understand the psychology of Scientology. What was actually going on? What was Hubbard actually doing? He was enslaving us. And Conway and Siegelman, who wrote the extremely interesting book Snapping, and came up with the term information disease to try and describe what had happened at Jonestown, that, the way people's minds are taken over. They studied members from many different groups, and they said Scientologists are the worst, the most impaired of all former members. So with Moonies, with Krishnas, 3 to 6 months after they leave, they'll normalize, they'll get back into the world. Scientology is self-perpetuating in people's minds. And so they thought that it would take about 12 and a half years unaided to get away from the thought reform that's gone on in Scientology. They said that in the 90s. I wrote to them in, I think, 2013 and said, you were guessing, weren't you? And wouldn't it be more true to say that unaided, most people will never recover from Scientology, because it is so much more sophisticated than Chinese brainwashing, or than the MK Ultra program run by the CIA. It is something that takes over the way that you think. And so for many people, as in your case, if you're brought up within it, it is the way you see the world. And so escaping from that and helping others to escape from that. Jefferson Hawkins in Portland, Oregon, I talked with him a month or so back, and I was delighted to find that he has a group of people who are ex-members, and they will talk about the truth of Scientology. We've talked about the abuses, we've talked about the experiences, but is it true? Is any of it true? If you increase affinity, will you increase communication? If you increase communication, will you increase affinity? Hubbard says you always do. It's a triangle. It always, increases or decreases at the same rate. And you kind of go, well, so if you communicate with somebody, they'll like you more. There you are. There's a simple truth of the universe. And you're going, so if I yell at somebody and call them names the way that Hubbard used to do very frequently with people, they'll like me more. So, this is the foundation of Scientology. It's nonsense. But it's important for people to think about that, to go back and look at what Hubbard said and say, do I agree with that? Can I be self-determined? Am I allowed to say, well, this is nonsense? I must say I rejected it all in 1984, and I've never felt inclined to take any of it back, because any ideas that seem even reasonable, he stole from somewhere else, which I have written about. And otherwise, he tended to twist ideas, because, as he said, to make something continue, you have to enter a lie into it. For something to persist, there must be a lie in it, what he called alter isness. And so he did, and so it goes on. So, but there's a community there. What I would love to see, and what I'd hoped to see 10 years ago, I started a group called the Open Minds Foundation. And the idea was that we would export what we had learned about authoritarian cults into the world in general. So I was at that time very concerned with de-radicalizing, how you deal with people who've been recruited into terrorist groups, because the mechanics are the same. What we see in Scientology, when I saw the Al-Qaeda recruiting manual, it's pretty much the dissemination drill by Scientology. It's pretty much the Moonies with their love bombing. You never disagree with anything the person says until eventually they'll strap on a suicide belt or do something like that. And I'd hope that former members would flock to help us. They didn't. And that gave me the suspicion that people weren't fully healed, because I think you're fully healed at the point where, as you're doing, you want to share your story. You want to help other people realize that they can recover, they can get over this, and there is a life. And that life is in the relationships we have, which is what you find when you leave, that there are people who really caring people like Janice, for example, or you mentioned Hannah Eltringham, Hannah Whitfield, as she now is. There are many people. Mike Rinder, I came to know Mike quite well, and Mike had harassed me for 20 years, so I had every reason to not like him. And he understood what he'd done, and he took responsibility for what he'd done, and he then dedicated the rest of his life to helping people to escape from this awful trap and from traps like it. So my hope is your book will come out. It will help people to understand more thoroughly this sort of situation, not just Scientology, but the many other abusive groups out there, and give them strength to overcome their own trials and tribulations.
Thank you, John. Yeah. And what it gave my parents permission to do, it gave my parents, that's kind of the premise for my book, was it Scientology, or would my parents have already had these propensities? So I think Scientology gave them permission
Yeah.
It gave my father permission to do what he did. It gave my mother permission to not be the kind of parent that maybe she would have been otherwise,
Mm.
to jeopardize, the well-being of her family, in pursuit of, all of the craziness of Scientology. And, just to end, I didn't realize, I thought I had shut the door, walked away, and I was young. So, how much harm could that have done?
Yeah.
And I realized, I'm in my sixth decade of life here. I realized that what I learned as a child, as a Scientologist, is really hard to not believe any longer as an adult. It's really hard. And I
Mm.
hadn't realized that until I started thinking about some of those core beliefs
Mm.
that you have in life, about death and love and, how you communicate with people and relationships. And it really was influenced by that in not a positive way.
Mm.
Fear of doctors, fear of medicine, fear of, all of those things that Scientology preaches, because I was indoctrinated that way. And those were the beliefs of my parents, and I was raised that way.
Mm.
And I think even for my mother at the end of her life, she was able to, I want to say, normalize as best she could her Scientology experiences to live her life in the present.
Mm.
So when she would talk about being on the Royal Scotsman, it was almost as if we'd been on a cruise. Like she tried to normalize, so all the different places we got to visit. And so I started to think that way because my mother spoke that way. And I didn't realize until doing all of my research, well, that was no cruise. That was not, a very positive experience at all for any of us. And so I think at the end of her life, too, with Dawn Breeding, making that connection was a way for her to say she didn't make a mistake, maybe. And
Yes.
to be able to accept the choices that she had made in her life, that they weren't bad, maybe after all.
Yeah. Yes. And to justify what had happened. And of course, because doing Scientology had pushed her into psychosis along the way.
Yeah.
How absolutely dreadful. There's a book called Escaping Utopia, which I have somewhere here. I'm sure I do. Yep. Growing up in a cult, getting out and starting over, Janja Lalich and Carla McLaren. And
Okay. That looks great.
specifically for people who are born into a group, which is a different experience from being recruited into a group. Also, Janja published a book called Take Back Your Life, with Madeline Tobias, which can be
Yeah, I'm
extremely
very
helpful.
familiar with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, very familiar with that one. So I so appreciate you speaking with me today, John. I learned so much.
Well, thank you.
As always, there's so much more to learn. So, my story is a brief snapshot in the world of Scientology, but it's my story, of, what happened to me and my family. So, like I said, I'm hoping that it helps someone, and it has been healing. And the bonus has been getting to meet everyone
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
getting to connect and to have those shared experiences, like you said, in that positive way of that, we're survivors.
We are indeed. And I must say for myself that I'm the happiest I've ever been, whatever Ron Hubbard thinks.
Yeah.
For me, Scientology was a tremendously confusing and unhelpful experience. I managed to thrive. I had a couple of years in art college. I established a career as an artist, despite Scientology, really, certainly not by the use of it. But then when I left, I gave that away because I realized after 9 years of believing that I was involved in a group that was saving the world, I was actually involved in a group that was destroying its own members. And there was such a flood of damaged people. And I'd been lucky because I was treated as a celebrity. I wasn't making any money, but I was an artist, I was a musician, I was a writer. I was 28 when I left. So I hadn't been abused and humiliated. Everybody I met, without exception, and I've met hundreds and hundreds of former members, something was taken from them. Their lives were not improved by the experience, and many came away with traumatic experiences that they found very difficult to live with. I'm very happy to say that, I don't really do it anymore, but I've worked with about 600 people one-on-one, all of whom have got back to life, none of whom have gone into another cult. And that's been an incredibly rewarding experience to see people escape and grow. So let us know when your book comes out. I'll probably talk with you again then, and we'll promote it like crazy. And it's been a tremendous pleasure meeting you today.
Thank you. I feel the same way, John. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.